Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior professional and an author from Singapore, Mr. Anindya Dutta. Anindya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. Thank you for having me. It's a delight being here.
Thank you. Anindya is the managing director of Two Roads Private Limited. He's an author, and all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of two books. Number one is Wizards, the story of Indian spin bowling. Which won India's Cricket Book of the Year award for 2019. His other book is Advantage India, which is a story of Indian tennis. Anindya has also worked with Deutsche Bank, Credit Agricole, ANZ, and American Express. So Anindya, before we start talking about Two Roads, tell me about your own journey in brief.
Sure. Just one small correction. I've written 6 books. That's 2 of them.
Okay. I stand corrected.
Okay. That's fine. And they're pretty much all on the history of sports thus far.
Okay.
So yeah, I started, I grew up all over India. My father was in Dunlop Tires. Wherever he went in the country to fix a problem for the company for a couple of years, I just followed him.
Okay.
So, and then went to college in Calcutta at Presidency College, and then went to the US, came back and got into banking and was a banker for about the next, 27 years.
Wow.
So yeah, so before I started Two Roads, yes.
Fantastic. So tell me about Two Roads now. What was your motivation to start it, and what do you do here?
Sure. Look, I mean, in my 27 years of banking, I was running teams for about 26 of them. So that's a lot of cumulative leadership experience, good and bad. So you learn a lot of things as you go along. And one of the things that so leadership was something I was always very passionate about how I led my teams, how I inspired them, how we did as a team. And I was very curious about it. And one of the things that I realized, the second half of my banking career, if you like, is that there isn't a lot which senior leaders receive in terms of guidance, if you like, or inspiration, if you like, in terms of how to solve the problems that beset them, especially as they go up the ladder. And the other thing that I realized from speaking to friends in different sectors is that the problems are really leadership problems, and they are completely sector agnostic. And finally, as a senior leader, I always had a bit of a, maybe that's a very personal thing, but I had a very bit of a antipathy, if you like, towards leadership trainers who hadn't had the same experience as I had in leading teams, coming and telling me what I should be doing with my teams from a theoretical standpoint, right? Sometimes it's useful. A lot of the time, senior leaders find it very difficult to take, just because there's a dichotomy between the experience and the thing. So when I decided to leave banking, I set up Two Roads, which is a leadership firm, but it's a leadership firm which looks at leadership very differently. And it's difficult to talk about Two Roads without going into a bit about my writing journey.
Absolutely.
And I'll tell you why there's a link between the two. So about a decade ago, I started writing on sports history of all things, which I'd never written on before. And what happened was I realized that two things. One is, and we can come back to the writing later, but that I had a love of history always. And I had a love of sports, and I was able to blend the two together and bring it out in a way which people liked reading. But more importantly, once I started going on that journey, I met a lot of elite sports people and people connected with elite sports around the world.
Right.
And I realized that a lot of them have this ability to transfer leadership lessons from the sports that they are engaged in to business lessons. Correct. The only gap there is because they don't have business leadership experience, so they don't necessarily address the right issues. So I decided to bring the two together. And so how Two Roads started is I started looking at leadership for senior leaders with a completely outside-in lens, where I would pick up stories from elite sports, success stories, failure stories, and analyze that from a business context to show how running teams, as I said, is industry agnostic. So it's as industry agnostic as there's no difference between sports and banking, for example, right? Because the challenges are the same. The solutions in a lot of places are the same. And having an outside-in lens allows you to look at things very differently. From what you're doing at your workplace. Correct. And it opens up vistas that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so that's the journey Two Roads is
amazing. On. Amazing. So let's move to leadership now, since you've told me this. And let me start by asking you that you just spoke about leadership in sports and leadership in the corporate world. And you also told me that sports leaders may not necessarily have business leadership experience, but what are some of the synergies that exist between sports leadership and corporate leadership?
Sure. I think it's leadership in general, right? And for me, there's so many things in leadership, right? But some of the most important things, as far as I'm concerned, for a leader to be successful, regardless of which industry you're in, what you're doing, is first, have an open and curious mind. Because if you have a closed mind, you are never going to be a leader who takes the business anywhere or your team anywhere, right? There is this obvious thing of the ability to inspire others, right? And again, I think this is something which is misunderstood by a lot of people, that inspiring others doesn't always mean you need to lead from the front. You can inspire with your deeds, by the way you work, by the way you approach issues, by the qualities you display as a human being, right? So that ability to inspire others, I think, is also a very important quality in a leader. Empathy for others. If you do not have empathy for others in your team, you are going to succeed for a while, but then it's just not going to work in the long term. Right? Because people realize very quickly that you don't have that empathy, and then they don't treat you with respect. Right? Something which is very personal, I guess, that ethical, honest, with integrity. In the long term, the really successful leaders, I think, have all of these three. Correct. You can have short wins by being, aggressive, breaking the rules, but then you're going to basically end up like FTX, right? Or Madoff or one of those. Yeah. And finally, again, and this is probably for me the best definition of a distinction between a manager and a leader, is that a leader does not display insecurity in themselves, right? They do not have any trouble in giving responsibility to people in their team. They do not fear that their position will be taken over, because the way I looked at leadership all the time was, if I had very capable people in my team, that team would go places. Correct. It would take me places, and it gave me an opportunity to move up and do something else.
Well said. Well said.
Right.
Well
so
said.
Long answer, but I thought I'd give you a perspective.
That's a great response. But now let's talk a little bit about how some of the leadership trends seem to be changing. When I started working with ITC in 1979, and then, over the years, there were always superstar leaders, iconic individuals in iconic corporations around the world. Today, that seems to have reduced dramatically. I'd love to get your perspective on what are some of the changing trends you are noticing when you talk of leadership.
Well, I think the iconic leadership, iconic companies continue to exist, and they will, right? Because that's a That's a type of leader that human beings genetically look forward to. I mean, look up to, right? I think the difference is that those leaders and those companies have shorter shelf lives than before. Right? You mentioned ITC, a company like ITC. I mean, whether you like tobacco or you don't like tobacco, but you can't question its shelf life and where it's been all these years, right? And clearly, there's a leadership, I guess, a legacy, which has been there. There's a certain culture which flows through that. So I think that the difference is that because of the new generation of younger leaders who have come in, or the new generation of people in the workforce, the leaders who were very autocratic, who I think are finding it very difficult to survive in the long term. There are more and more leaders who, whether you call it a servant-based leadership, or whether it's even people who lead from the front, but they're much more inclusive. So I think inclusive leadership is perhaps something that has changed.
Fair enough. The other aspect, Anindya, which is often discussed and debated, is the impact of culture on leadership. Some cultures are naturally able to provide leadership. Some cultures are not able to, because some are more introvertish, etc. What are your perspectives, and how does culture impact leadership?
You mean in terms of where the leaders come from,
Correct.
where they've grown up?
Yeah.
I think it's getting a bit blurred now. You had the whole aggressive American leadership style, which, again, from what I was just talking about, I think has had to take a back seat even in the United States. Right? You have a lot of, there's a lot of discussions on social media about the number of Indian leaders in positions of power all over the world today, particularly in the tech industry. But if you look at them, they are not typically what you would say male-centric, typical Indian leaders as you would find over the last 30, 40 years. I think they are successful because they have become much more inclusive and able to lead a global workforce. So I think it's getting a bit blurred in terms of culture.
Great response. Thank you. The other aspect that I wanted to get your perspective on is technology. How is technology changing leaders and leadership?
I think it's forced leaders to change because technology is here. It's improving the way we do business. It's improving the way we lead teams. And as teams have got more dispersed and virtual, if you like, technology is something that really enhances how you lead teams. So people, the one challenge has been, and I guess we are fortunate in that we've grown through this whole technology boom over the past few decades, that people who have not fallen behind and are able to embrace the technology are making better leaders. Even, if you look at the pandemic and post, well, I'm touching wood and calling it post-pandemic, but in the post-pandemic world, if you like, there are a few leaders around still who are insisting that their people come back to work 100%.
Yeah.
But I think those are few and far between, right? And I think it doesn't make sense for leaders to do that just because of where technology has gone in the recent past. And the last 3 years have been transformational in terms of, you and I are having this, the podcast, which, 5 years ago would have been a bit more difficult, I would say.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So I have two more questions on leadership, and then I'll move to your book.
Sure.
What is your perspective on how men and women leaders are different?
Okay. I think the basic traits of leadership are very human. So they don't change so much. I think the difference is sometimes in the level of empathy. It is in the perspectives that women bring to the table, which men often overlook just because, men and women think differently. I mean, that's the reality, which is exactly why I'm a very, very big fan of having women in leadership positions, because the more women you have in leadership positions, the more the diversity of thinking you have in your team, right? And more the diversity of thinking you have in your team, the better your team can perform. So I think those are two things. Probably empathy, women score over men for sure, in most cases. And the perspective that they bring sometimes can be very, very different. I mean, I can tell you from a very simple example of a marriage perspective. Sometimes I have these insolvable problems in my head and I overanalyze them, and my wife spends like 2 minutes and gives me a perspective. I'm like, okay, that's really the solution. Why didn't I think of it in that way, right?
Well said.
So I think it comes with all of us.
I'm in complete agreement with you on that. My next question is on the younger leaders. I'm from the boomers generation, but how are millennial leaders and Gen Z leaders who are now getting into positions of influence in the corporate world, how are they changing the leadership paradigm?
Well, I think they're embracing technology and embracing a different way of leading, which is causing older leaders to change their way of working as well, because they are very quickly becoming a large part of the workforce and the most important, most productive part of the workforce, if you like. So they are, on one side, much more inclusive. They are much more tech savvy, so they look at things differently. On the other, I think they suffer from a lack of perspective and tend to ignore history, as a result of which they end up making a lot of fatal mistakes, especially, very young, high-profile entrepreneurs, I think, sometimes take the view that since something has not happened in the last 10 years, it can never happen. And so I think it's a mix of the two, and it'll sort of evolve over time. But I think that largely they're changing leadership for good in many ways.
Fantastic, thank you. So let me now move to your books, Anindya. You've written from cricket to tennis, and you just told me a few minutes ago about your love for history and your love for sports and your love for leadership. And you seem to have combined all of these three loves into your books. But tell me about your books, and you told me 6 books you've written. Tell me about some of your books.
Well, Wizards was something which came out of my childhood passion of going to my first cricket test match at the Eden Gardens and watching the Bishan Singh Bedi, Chandrasekhar, Prasanna bowl at the West Indies. I was 7 years old, and that sort of lifelong passion for spin bowling. So when the chance came to write the first book for a big publisher, which was Westland, I chose to write on spinners, and there wasn't a good history written from the beginning about Indian spinners. So I just wrote it in the way I would want to read it, which was chronological, but also with backstories and sort of showing the evolution of Indian spin bowling, which has been probably the most important part of Indian cricket, over the 100 years that India's been playing. So that's where it came from. Yeah.
And then what about tennis?
So tennis was interesting because after Wizards came out and it won the award, I was contacted by the publisher to ask, what do you want to write on next? That was literally the conversation we had. And tennis is the other sport I'm really passionate about, and no history of Indian tennis had ever been written.
Okay.
So this is the first and the only history in existence of Indian tennis. And when I it was a bit of a daunting task because I didn't realize it when I took it on. But when I went to do the research during the pandemic, actually, I realized that there was no written records. There were no written records. The Indian Tennis Association had never kept written records. The South Club in Calcutta, which is the home of Indian tennis, had no library. I literally had to go back, find books, go to the British newspaper archives for the last couple of 100 years, and write the entire history of Indian tennis. And what I also found, again, you mentioned my love of history, that Indian tennis, early Indian tennis, has huge connections with Indian history. And the characters who were tennis players, including a gentleman who went to number 6 in the world, was one of the characters around the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Wow.
So it's just very rich in where it's come from, and that's something which really excites me. So I think it's going to press today. The second edition is going to press today of Advantage India, the story of Indian tennis.
One more question on books,
Sure.
and then I'll come to my last question.
Sure.
What goes into writing a book on sports?
Passion, absolute determination that every fact that I put on the paper is thoroughly researched and can never be refuted, and writing in a way where any reader, whether she or he be a sports lover or not, feels compelled to turn a page.
Fascinating. Thank you. That's a great response. And my last question to you, Anindya, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey from the world of banking to consulting, leadership advice, author, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from your journey and from our conversation?
Okay. I think from my bank, if I was to sort of dissect it in my mind, from my banking journey, what I take away is that even people I dealt with 20 years ago, today continue to have both respect for my knowledge, but more importantly, respect for me as a person. When we have interactions today. And for me, that's a really big takeaway, that you do the right things, you live life the right way, it's something that you will always treasure. As far as my writing career, really, I mean, it was something completely unexpected. As I said, I'd never written before, and the love recognition for the writing and the fact that people want to read more has been hugely rewarding. So go for a passion, any passion that you have, go for a passion, do your best with that passion, that's the road to success in anything that you do. Just do it to the best of your ability, whatever you do. Right?
Correct.
And finally, if I was to say something which probably my failures taught me, if you like, is that when faced with a situation, step back, pause, reflect. A boss of mine, a French boss many years ago, once told me, when I was grappling with a problem that I thought was ending my world. And he heard me ranting about it for 15 minutes, and then he turned to me and said, "No one has died." Right? So you always have time to react.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, Anindya, and your 3 amazing lessons. First one you said was based on all your banking relationships, how critical relationships are, and they last you for 2 decades, as you said, and for forever if the relationships are strong. Second, you said from your writing world, go for your passion, do your best, and as they say in the Gita, don't wait for the rewards, they will follow automatically.
Absolutely.
And the third one you said was, which is so powerful, step back, pause, and reflect every time you're faced with a challenge. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for talking to me about two roads. Thank you for talking to me at such length about leadership. I think I got some amazing perspectives from you on different aspects of leadership over the years. Thank you also for talking to me about your books and I'm amazed to find someone who's writing from cricket to tennis. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Ashutosh. Thank you for having me here. And, good questions always get good answers, as I say. So thank you for the good questions.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.